Today, September 30th, is Orange Shirt Day and the first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. This is a day to recognize Canada's tragic history and legacy of residential school systems in Canada and their long-lasting effects on First Nations communities and individuals. 150 years ago, the Canadian government established residential schools with the goal to assimilate First Nations children into Canadian culture. However, many children were abused and many died. Why orange? We wear orange because of Phyllis Webstat. Phyllis Webstat was sent to a residential school when she was 6 years old. Her family was very poor, but her grandmother bought her a new orange shirt for her first day. When she arrived at school, officials stripped her of her shirt. But they didn't strip her of her clothing, they stripped her of her language, tradition, and cultures, like they did to many other First Nations. Today you are wearing orange not only for Phyllis Webstat, but for the thousands of First Nations children sent to residential schools. In June, the federal government announced a new statutory holiday, the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. This is not only a day to remember and reflect, but a day that asks us to call on our actions and learn about Canada's tragic history of residential schools. The National Day of Truth and Reconciliation fulfills the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Calls to Action number 80. We call upon the federal government, in collaboration with Aboriginal peoples, to establish as a statutory holiday a National Day for Truth and Reconciliation to honor survivors and their families, and communities, and ensure that public commemoration of the history and legacy of residential schools remains a vital component of the reconciliation process.
So what were residential schools? Residential schools were a school system created by the Canadian government. Indigenous children were forced to go to these schools with the goal to assimilate them to the Euro-Canadian culture. Indigenous children were separated from their families without choice for long periods of time, and they were prohibited from embracing their Indigenous culture. Residential schools operated in Canada from the 1870s to the 1990s. At the schools, the children suffered terrible abuse as the government tried to eliminate their Indigenous heritage. They were forbidden from speaking their native languages, their hair was cut short, and they were forced to wear uniforms. Although we may not have been born when the last residential school was closed in 1996, this isn't just history from the far past. This is something still very recent, and we have a long journey to go towards reconciliation. These schools have caused devastating effects to Indigenous communities as children were not able to grow up learning their Indigenous way of life. As a result, they did not gain the knowledge to pass on traditions to their own families, essentially causing a grave loss of culture.
Hey everyone, my name is Ahmed Hwamde, and we just heard Amani talk a little bit about what residential schools were and their lasting impact on Indigenous communities. And so now I want to shift the conversation a little bit into the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, what that was and what does that mean. And so the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a report released on June 2nd, 2015, 6 years after 6 years of hearings and testimonies from over 6,000 residential school survivors and their loved ones. The report includes 94 calls to action that various Canadian institutions can take to help reconcile our nation's dark past with residential schools. As of June 30th, 2021, only 14 of the 94 calls to action have been completed after 6 years of the report's initial release. One large part of the report is this focus on education, and there's this one quotation that I particularly like from Justice Murray St. Clair, and he says, "Education is what got us here, and education is what can get us out." As students and educators, it is important that we recognize that there are things that we can all do in our daily lives and in our Agincourt school community to help reconcile our nation's dark past and uplift and empower Indigenous communities.
Most recently, with the discovery of hundreds of unmarked graves at residential school sites across Canada, we've been hearing a lot about reconciliation. These deaths were already known, but the nationwide search has only now begun with the new availability of resources. The first discovery was at the Kamloops Residential School in BC, where 215 children were found buried. The missing children were as young as 3 years old, and all were undocumented deaths. The undocumented, unmarked graves of 160 children at Kuper Island Residential School and 182 children at the St. Eugene's Mission Residential School in BC were also later found. In Saskatchewan, 751 children were found buried at the Maryville Residential School, 35 at the Muskowaquan Residential School, and 38 at the Regina Residential School. Only a few of Canada's 139 residential schools have yet been searched, and though numbers are already overwhelming, it's important to remember that behind each number is a child that got taken away from their family and never returned home. When we talk about reconciliation, especially now after a heartbreaking summer, it's important to understand the meaning behind it. Reconciliation is fundamentally the restoration of balanced relationships, but it goes much further than that. To move forward, we must recognize truth and continue taking part in education. It's a process that is continuous and not a box to be checked. It must consist of apologies and forgiveness, mutual respect, and hard work on both parts. Reconciliation is a way of life. It's what you choose to do every day to work towards the change that we need.
So now that we heard Maya talk a little bit about reconciliation and what that means in 2021, I want to read this one quotation from Bob Joseph, an Indigenous author and educator. And he says, "As often stated, reconciliation is not an Indigenous problem, it's a Canadian problem. And every Canadian needs to be aware of the very dark, but not distant, as the last residential school closed in 1996. Must be aware of the very dark period of history and understand that it has caused an intergenerational and ongoing impact, and find ways and means to support reconciliation. In the words of my father, Chief Robert Joseph, we start today. We start every little step. If we start right now, and this is a moment of reconciliation for some of us, it's a huge, huge achievement." So now that you've heard a little bit from students on their thoughts on reconciliation, we wanted to hear from a few of our teachers at our school and what reconciliation meant to them as educators. As an educator, what does reconciliation mean to you?
I often think about how little my generation knew as teenagers about First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, and how many opportunities we've had as adults to learn. And so I like to take every opportunity I can to learn along with my students. And for me, that means amplifying the voices of Indigenous peoples and taking the time during my classes to learn as much as we can.
Pour moi, la réconciliation, c'est l'inclusion non seulement de la voix autochtone dans les décisions, mais vraiment une valorisation de ces voix. Et ce n'est pas juste écouter, mais c'est prendre de l'action sur ce qu'ils disent.
For me, reconciliation as a teacher means listening, acknowledging what I don't know, seeking to find answers from first-person Indigenous sources, elders, attending powwows, reading what I can, watching documentaries, and then doing my best to share those perspectives with my students in order to foster a conversation and get us all thinking about what our role is as individuals, as a community, to contribute to reconciliation as Canadians and in this country.
Et j'ajouterais que, oui, premièrement, j'ai besoin de faire de la réflexion moi-même à propos de ce qui s'est passé au Canada pour les personnes autochtones et de m'éduquer, d'écouter, oui, les voix des personnes autochtones et des survivants, des pensionnats. Et puis dans mes classes, c'est très important que je mette en valeur les voix des personnes autochtones, des artistes autochtones, ces histoires, ces voix, leurs expériences, et de mener des discussions et donner du temps et de place aux élèves d'avoir des discussions et d'apprendre et de réfléchir à propos de ça.
Wonderful question. I think before we can focus on reconciliation, I think we need to focus on truth. I think that many Canadians are only now learning about the horrors and awful things that happened in our past. With this spring and summer when the bodies of all those Indigenous souls have been reported on, I think this was the first time many Canadians are learning about our history with our Indigenous people. So the first thing I'd really like to emphasize is that we need to spend some time on truth and learn about what exactly happened in the past before we can move into reconciliation. As an educator, I do have a unique opportunity to not only learn myself or unlearn things that I know about Indigenous people, but as an educator I can also influence what our students are learning and help my students to know about the truth of what has happened to our Indigenous people and how we can all move forward in reconciliation and make Canada a wonderful nation.
Now, moving on to the next slide, with the slide many of us may feel right now in a state of kind of shock and a state, okay, we understand this issue, now what can we truly do in our day-to-day lives, right? And it can sometimes feel overwhelming, right? This can feel like such a large issue and not something that one person can help solve. But if each of us do take small actions, there can be a large impact. So whether that's participating in a walk for reconciliation, reading and supporting, reading Indigenous books, right? If you go to the library right now, there is a huge display of many novels written by Indigenous authors. Supporting Indigenous artists and films are all ways that we can help uplift and empower Indigenous voices and their community. Now, I know this presentation has been very tough to listen to, but it's also really important to recognize that throughout this dark period of Canadian history, of our collective history, Indigenous people have fought and resisted to hold onto their culture, and their cultures have survived. They have always been on this land, and they will continue to be, and that this resilience is what is needed to be, is what needs to be supported and celebrated, because that is the true path to reconciliation and a better future for all Canadians. Just like Bob Joseph said in a few slides, reconciliation is not an Indigenous problem, it's a Canadian one. And we have to also change our mindset to realize that throughout the process of reconciliation is not only for Indigenous people, but can help better our collective society and all of us as Canadians. Now, Agincourt, I want to just, before I end off in our last slide, I want to thank some of our administration. I want to thank the administration for allowing us to do this. I want to thank Ms. Clark for helping to put this together, Ms. Cullen, Mr. Petrick, Madame Lang, Madame Morrison, and Madame Herrera for all participating in this video. I want to thank Amani, Maya, and Sophia for participating and helping to put this video together, and all the teachers for playing this and taking time out of your day, out of the precious work day to help a school day to help play this video. Thank you guys so much for listening. And Agincourt, before we leave, I just want this last slide. I want everybody to kind of think about this last question. What will you do to help reconcile our nation's dark past and move forward in a direction of unity and prosperity for all Canadians? Thank you guys so much for listening, and I hope you guys have an amazing day.